you for joining us today, Dr.
Thank you for inviting me.
Very important topic, and thank you for being flexible with your schedule. The importance of the endocannabinoid system, what people may or may not know is that there is a system within the body, and it has been discovered, I would say, more recently than the other vital systems. However, there's a big purpose of it within all mammals, which means people and pets. So could you go into the explanation of what the ECS is and what it does for us?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me today. And yeah, this is going to be a lecture that's going to be a little bit more didactic and a little bit more educational focused because, yeah, I think it's important. All the other things that people talk about will be more like, practical, like spiritual, environmental, food, but I'm going to give that information because as we start talking a little bit more and people become more usually open with using hemp products or cannabis products or just even understanding the word CBD in their lifetime or their lifestyle, it's important to understand the endocannabinoid system, just kind of the basics of that, because it is more complex than people will proclaim it to be. So let me get started here. First of all, as an integrative physician, we are, practicing evidence-based medicine. We want to get into the actual detail because what's happening, particularly in the last few years, as this explosion of, hemp and cannabis has, appropriately so, has swept the nation. Some of it good, some of it bad. It's that we're trying to refocus, just like the previous speaker said about evidence-based and having data, so we can look at safety. We can actually recommend protocols over at the end of the time, because there also is an explosion on the internet. You can see of, almost everybody on social media right now is some kind of expert in this field in treating patients, and that can be quite discerning and sometimes dangerous because people don't understand the complexity of the body, and sometimes just say, oh, just take this and it's going to cure everything. And so today I'm going to get down to the nitty-gritty of just the endocannabinoid system in the short time that we have today, talking about CB1, Cb2 receptors and what they are and actually how they kind of work and where they're located, because once you understand that, then you're going to look at like, wow, I need to have a little bit more guidance sometimes when I take this, or in terms of sourcing, am I getting something that's organic? Does it have this full, cannabinoid profile, or does it have terpenes in it? Does it have a full terpene profile? And if they're adding herbs, what's the synergy of those things rather than formulas that are just throwing things together? So the endocannabinoid system, just in general, consists of like two of these, what they call G-coupled protein receptors, CB1, which you'll hear a lot about, and CB2. And a lot of times, when we first started off, many years ago, it was just kind of simply discussed as CB1 being, above your head and CB2 being below the neck and the body. And now we actually know that it's absolutely incorrect. And so if anybody's talking about CB1 above the head and CB2, they're just way behind on the data. And in fact, now there's actually a third receptor that's been coming up in the literature, in the science of once we understand a little bit more about immunology and we have testing to look at. And there's a third receptor, it's a GPR55 receptor. So even though we talk about CB1, CB2, there's going to be probably coming in the future many, many more. Now, the most important thing about understanding this endocannabinoid system and understanding how this affects the immune system is that it is not a simple on and off switch. So a lot of people think you just take it, it's going to turn something on, it's going to turn something off, kind of a one-to-one relationship. It's not. It's a very complex response because it has to deal with the interaction between what we call endogenous and exogenous ligands. That means molecules that are binding to something that are produced in our body or things that we take externally, like from the diet or from the environment. There's also cross reactions with even non-cannabinoid receptors. So it's not just these two or maybe three that we know now. There's other receptors that it is linking to, cross-linking to, and also more importantly, which is something that most people don't understand, and this is kind of the area that we've been focusing on in the research clinically, is it's also dependent on the local tissue characteristics or the health state of the individual and also of that organ or area of function of these receptors. And so it's not just, oh, take this for this condition. We have to look at all these different parameters. And so there's different kind of, I won't get into the biochemistry, but there's like negative and positive coupling. It can simply just do like calcium channels and potassium channels. But when we look at the amount of the activity, or we call the molecular targets of using CBD, say just in neurological conditions and neurological disorders, the receptors are only about 15%. Another 15% is ion channels. Another 20% is transporters, and another 50% is enzymes. So these are things that people don't think of, because everything's, again, you take it, it's going to turn on a switch like a light switch and turn off a switch like that. It's not like that. Actually, it's a whole cascade of effects. And so when we think of CB1, I always like to just kind of give this kind of simple thing. CB1, think of memory, cognition, emotion, and pain. So memory, cognition, emotion, and pain. That's what the CB1 receptor is. Now, where is this located in the brain? Interesting thing is, when I was in medical school, they never mentioned this. When we're in neuroanatomy lab and we're actually, dissecting human brains and cadavers, and you take neuroanatomy, they didn't mention these receptors. And the reason being is because we didn't understand that they actually truly existed. And more importantly, it's because since we didn't have a pharmacological drug for it at the time, now there is CBD prescriptions and stuff that are coming through the pipeline, already one that's available for 2 or 3 different rare syndromes for seizures, that we didn't know about it. So even though like the rest of the world, especially Europe, which was about 20 years ahead, 30 years ahead in the research, they were looking at these kind of receptors through the study of science, and they were actually applying different kind of aspects of using plant medicines, cannabis or hemp products. But, here, since it's kind of a pharmaceutical driven industry, we didn't get that information. So it's not until recently, like probably right now, a student in medical school taking neuroanatomy, they will be understanding these receptors, because now since we have a drug that's out, FDA approved, then, we kind of unfortunately learn sometimes a drug to physiology rather than physiology to whatever else is in the environment, drug, natural, diet, environmental, etc. But CB1, remember, memory, cognition, emotion, and pain. And it's pretty much in your frontal cortex, your cingulate gyrus, your parietal regions, your basal ganglia, your substantia nigra, hypothalamus, thalamus, your brainstem, your cerebellum. So almost every part, it's like the most dense receptor of our brain is these cannabinoid receptors. And yet, we missed it in medical school. And so, but also I want to make sure that people understand that if you understand the parts of the brain and how they work, then it gives someone more of a guidance on how to use these things appropriately to help balance or to help improve function of a condition. It's not just, again, taking this and it's going to get everything better. And in fact, it's actually at the end, we call it these dense expressed cortical and hippocampal presynaptic boutons. And not to get too specific, but it's not just, again, it's a release of something. There's also feedback mechanisms, which is important, because really at the end of the day, when we're talking about stimulating the endocannabinoid system, it's all about homeostasis. So it's not always just like, a lot of people misuse this concept saying like, oh, well, we're going to kill cancer because we're going to take cannabis, or we're going to, just lower inflammation. But what it is actually doing is it's trying to bring the body into balance by stimulating the immune system via a variety of cascade of mechanisms. That's very complex. And so it's not just a suppressive thing or an exciting thing or a, sedative. We're actually looking at trying to bring the body back into its homeostatic balance. But that homeostatic balance is only benefited when the patient or the person is actually doing all the lifestyle epigenetic changes that they need to do to get better. Because a lot of times what happens, people will fail, is that if they're having the standard American diet and lifestyle, for example, and then they take CBD or cannabis and or hemp, and they go, gosh, how come it's not working as much as it should be? It's because they haven't done all the other things to make it work better for them. So I'll get into that as well. Now, the interesting thing I want to talk about today, to get in a little bit more detail, is the Cb2 receptors. And again, it wasn't until 2016 where the literature started getting more and more specific about this, because again, we used to think, CB2 below the neck only. And now we know that the Cb2 receptors are also in the brain. And this is fascinating, because there's 4 parts of the brain that it plays, that it turns on regulation. Something called astrocytes, microglial cells, oligodendrocytes, and blood-brain barrier. And I'll explain a little bit about all of these. Now, when we think about astrocytes, again, many of you may not have heard these words before, but it's important to understand, you don't have to be a doctor, but you have to understand like how this is playing a role in brain function. So like the previous speaker was talking about, PTSD and trauma or schizophrenia. Now we're understanding a lot of this has to do with not only the brain receptors, but gut receptors, okay? And so this is very important, and I'll explain towards the end how these will all be connected. When we look at astrocytes, astrocytes are the cells in your brain that actually control the metabolic substrate, which it means that it gives what they call generation for neurotrophins. Neurotrophins are like brain-derived nerve growth factor. These are things that actually generate new neurons. So our brain is actually what we consider neuroplastic. It wasn't until about 10 years ago that in neuroscience, they started to realize that your brain is always kind of growing. We were kind of told, unfortunately, you were born with a certain amount of brain cells, and you went to college, you played football, you drank some beers, and then they kind of lost a bunch of them along the way. But now we understand that it's completely different. The brain is actually regenerating all the time. time. And it's always this response to, external factors, internal factors. And so the astrocytes help this metabolic substrate. They actually give anti-inflammatory mediators like interleukin-1 and interleukin-10, and also pro-survival factors such as transforming growth factor. Now, what this does is this inhibits what we call chemokines, particularly like fractalkine. Now, what is that? These are chemicals that the body produces through endogenous and exogenous, meaning sometimes it does it through trauma, sometimes it does it through, the diet and lifestyle and chemicals. But these are chemicals that come in called chemokines that actually create neurological damage. So when we start seeing, chronicity of issues of like Parkinson's disease and dementias and Alzheimer's disease, these are all chronic inflammatory diseases that are coming through chemicals and through diet and lifestyle, and we're looking at how these cells can actually help for that protection. Now, the second receptor, or the second cell that it's stimulating that the Cb2 receptors are on, are called microglial cells. And these are important in regulating this, what we call anti-inflammatory state and a pro-inflammatory state. And in short, there's just two states. One's called an M1 and an M2. And M1's a neurotoxic state, and it releases pro-inflammatory signals, okay? So these are like interleukin-1 beta, I believe IL-6 and IL-18. And also it induces nitric oxide. Now, a lot of people like, oh, I take nitric oxide for my exercise. I take beet shots and, all these kind of, L-arginine and all. You do need to have a certain amount of nitric oxide, but in this case, in the brain, it's more for vasodilation. And that's important when there's trauma, because the brain is going to try to induce swelling when, say, someone has a traumatic brain injury, to try to protect itself from further damage. So there's always like a little bit of inflammation is important in the balance and regulation of the body, but too much causes damage. And, if people want to learn more about inflammation, they can get my book, and Inflammation Nation, and I'll go through all the detail on the information on how you can, regulate and change diet, lifestyle, environment, and how do we actually have a chapter on explaining a little bit of the cannabinoid system as well. Now, in this neurotoxic state, on the opposite side, there's what they call an M2 state, and that's the neuroprotective state. And the nice thing about that secretes anti-inflammatories like IL-4, IL-10, and again, the nerve growth factor. So the brain is always in this balance of, and the body's always in this balance of homeostasis. We need to kind of fight, fix, and repair, rebuild, and regenerate all the time, because there's trauma, there's infections, there's viruses, there's cancer, there's injury, and then there's just long-term oxidation and inflammation, or aging, as we would call it. So instead of just the Cb2 receptors being in the body, which is now, like we know that's in some of your organs, we know that it's in your osteoclasts in your bones, your chondrocytes in your joints and your muscle tissue. So that's why when people take CBD products, for example, from hemp or from cannabis, they feel better, like if they're inflamed or they have some muscle ache or joint pain. But really, we want to focus on the brain, because the brain is a fantastic area of research. Now, the third thing that these microglial cells do is that when they're active, now, interesting thing is they turn on more when there is more neuroinflammation. So the interesting thing is that we now see that when people have healthy brains and they're a healthy state, these are all going to be what these receptors are going to be in what they call a resting state. I'll talk about that in a minute. There's a difference between a resting and an active state. And this is what the industry is off, because a lot of people say, oh, I'm super healthy and you got to take this much dosing. And, the whole aspect of dosing is incorrect out there in terms of how to actually obtain a physiological response. And that's why a lot of people either will take CBD or hemp and cannabis and they'll say, oh, it was great. And a lot of people, and a majority of people say, I don't think I noticed anything. I don't think it was in there. I don't think I have enough. And that's when they're misunderstanding, like when they need to take it and who needs to take it and how much. But these microglial cells, when they're activated, they also help reduce like beta amyloid. And these are like certain things that we see like in Parkinson's disease or Alzheimer's diseases. We see like plaques and proteins and tangles and taus. These are kind of the, we call like waste products or reactionary products to inflammation. And the microglial cells are also associated with getting rid of it. Like, how do we get rid of the trash? How do we kind of detoxify the brain on a cellular function? Because remember, we have cells that are building and repairing all the time, waste products and damaged products. Now, the Cb2 receptors, interesting enough, are the data has been showing now playing an important role in schizophrenia, depression, food consumption, and drug addiction. So the previous lecturer was talking about, homeless people or schizophrenia, people with PTSD. So this is where this is playing an important role, because we're talking about bringing those functions that were dysfunctional due to a variety of reasons, diet, lifestyle, environment, even physical trauma, and looking at how we can bring that into balance. Now, more importantly, the Cb2 receptors that are focused more in the cerebellum and the brainstem, this has an important role, especially when there's a lot of neuroinflammation, when we see Parkinson's disease, traumatic brain injury, and MS, because those are all those functions where they're at. So that's why when people have like MS, they have balance problems, they have stability problems, they have problems with actually movement and weakness or spasticity of their muscles and joints. And so this is very important because we now have things that we used to think in conventional medicine, these were just, lifelong problems that people, we kind of just treated them symptomatically, but we never were able to kind of help improve or stave off the disease. And now we do. And now the research and clinical trials are actually showing that. Now, the third receptor that the Cb2 is on, the neurological cell that helps balance, is called oligodendrocytes. And this promotes survival, proliferation, and dedifferentiation of the myelin. So think of a neuron as an electrical cable, and you have the wires, and then you have this conduit that, it's usually like the rubber that goes around a cord. Like say you're plugging in your phone on your phone cord, and then after a while sometimes it bends and it gets frayed, and the signal doesn't go. Sometimes you don't charge your phone correctly because it's kind of been bent too much. So same thing with the neurons. The neurons in the brain with certain conditions like MS is that sheath, that myelin sheath, that conduit that keeps the signal of the brains going correctly and moving down the neuron itself, it gets frayed. Sometimes it's kind of like chunks are taken out, and then the signal doesn't go correctly. So that's why they have someone with MS will have like weakness or spasticity. So the interesting thing is this cell, oligodendrocytes, where the Cb2 receptor is present on, that activates to be more active, actually helps with that remyelination. So it's kind of like almost going back and putting some kind of tape around it, and kind of like, can we kind of heal some of this frayed aspect of our neurons? And then lastly, the fourth aspect is that it's on the blood-brain barrier. And this is super important because a lot of people don't understand the blood-brain barrier, but the blood-brain barrier, there's two big barriers that you have in your body. One of them is your brain, one of them is your gut. Now, the brain has a specific filter called blood-brain barrier where it prevents things from the rest of the body getting in, because this is the major control center of your body, right? And that's why, like, when people get sick, say if you have a pneumonia, go to the hospital, or say people have COVID or any kind of infection, what we're trying to do is we're trying to preserve, the body's trying to preserve the infection from actually getting to the brain. Because if it crosses over and into our brain, it's like an enclosed cavity. It doesn't have the place to move. It doesn't have the place to swell. So like your lungs can get swollen. You can even get fluid in your lungs and your colon and your GI tract. They all have space to have a little bit of a trauma or aggravation. But the brain is enclosed, so it can't really swell. It can't really have these kind of problems. And so this blood-brain barrier protects that from happening. However, through our diet and lifestyle, most of our barriers in our body are a little bit, I would say, lax. They're not as strong as they used to be or can be, and therefore some people are more susceptible. So when they get sick, they can easily get a meningitis or some kind of inflammation or infection in the brain, and that becomes more detrimental. And so we're looking at, how do we, not only prevent white blood cells or from parts of infection coming into our brain from bacteria, viruses, but also how do we actually clear like beta amyloid and other waste products. So the blood-brain barrier is important. And the other thing is, on the flip side, there's also Cb2 receptors in your gut barrier. And so when we think of ideas, conditions like colitis, and we think of like the little intestinal villi, these are the little villi, again, this will all be written in my book in detail, but how that, the leaky gut or the colitis or Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, irritable bowel disease, even the muscles in the GI tract have the Cb2 receptors. So people get spastic, they get a little bit diarrhea, they get constipation, they get kind of colon cramps. And this is the way that we can look at helping calm and lower that inflammatory response. Now, with the brain, we're looking at lowering inflammation and in the body. And so there's over a dozen now that they have figured out different kind of transporters of dimensions, channel gene expressions. But it's not just a simple on and off is what I wanted to get over today through the audience. And a lot of people say just take it and you're done. And you have to understand like how it's metabolized through the liver, what's the pathway, because it is not always safe to take it with a prescription drug or even other herbs. Some things can be synergistic, where can kind of upregulate it, and certain medications it actually could be worse. It actually increases the side effects or toxicity profile. So we have to be really cautious when people just kind of loosely say, take these things with everything and it's going to be the cure all. Really, I think there needs to be some kind of guidance sometimes that people should say, like, is this person taking any medication? Or maybe you should talk to someone who has a little bit more medical background along with the understanding of the endocannabinoid system or hemp and cannabis products, and looking at what should they look at that will influence it. Now, lastly, I want to talk about just briefly before I get into some of the conditions that we now see these receptors in, is individual SNPs. These are like the single nucleotide polymorphisms. So we know there's like 1.5 million, in our DNA that can happen. So it's like how our body even produces dopamine and serotonin, even though we know like, okay, it produces it here, produces in the gut, produces in the brain, but each person now can produce it differently. And more importantly, we now know the microbiome, which is so important right now. And right now, we're just learning the tip of the microbiome. I can always do a specific lecture on microbiome for you guys. But the microbiome now is one of the strongest regulators of the endocannabinoid system. And right now, since in the United States, most people have the standard American diet, right? They're eating pro-inflammatory foods that have very little, no, phytonutrients, little to no antioxidants, has cholesterol, and it's pro-inflammatory. These things are triggering dysfunction in the gut. And since our gut, 80% of our gut is also where 80% of our immune system is functioning. And remember, those Cb2 receptors are actually in the barriers of how the food comes in and even how the digestion function is working. This is a key in understanding. If you don't get the gut right, then even your endocannabinoid system of taking, cannabis or hemp products won't work. And so one of the things, as a chief medical officer of Bloom Hemp, what I've done is that when we're looking at even making certain formulas, like we have an essentials line that just came out this year. Again, USDA organic hemp with sprouted hemp oil. When we add certain herbs, we're actually looking at, if I'm using my herbal medicine background and training, how do we give those things to help balance? But we're actually looking at synergy. So it's not just looking at, it's CBD and its compounds, and more importantly, its terpenes, but we're looking at how to add, herbs. And then not only looking at the herbs' main constituents, but even the herbs itself will have terpenes. And then how do we blend those together to actually find, a comprehensive profile so that we can actually induce the healing. But microbiome is key. Like everybody has to understand that if you have leaky gut, if you have, SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, you have gut dysbiosis, if you have candida, parasites, or any kind of digestive problems, which most people, because we know we've had antibiotics and surgeries and people had to take chemotherapy for cancer, and just eating the standard American diet lifestyle with all the things that we get exposed to, that affects that. So that's why when some people say, oh, I took this product, or I take, cannabis, or I take hemp on any level, sometimes they feel really good. And some people are like, I take all of it and I don't get any benefits. And they're kind of like, oh, it's not for me. We have to understand it's like that the body actually has to be in a place to actually be receptive to all these different pathways, immunological mechanisms, enzymes, transporters, and receptors to actually have this, magical benefit that everybody proclaims that will happen. A couple of just a review of some of the literature real quick. Pancreatitis, we now know that the receptors are seen there. Allergic asthma, endotoxic shock. I know acne vulgaris has a really strong, when people have that really bad cystic acne, has a really good anti-inflammatory effect in repairing, the skin turnover. And then rheumatoid arthritis. Let me just bring this up because this will go back to that resting state and active state. So a lot of people thought, even I thought, when, it was about 10 years ago when we started using these things, was when someone has a condition like certain drugs, there's a what they call a dose response curve. So like the more you take, the worse your pain, you need more, right? Like double it, triple it kind of thing. Like, so, oh, you have a headache, take this. And if you have worse pain, you take more. And so some drugs, they call a dose response curve. You just take more based on the amount of dysfunction. Oh, someone's got a bigger tumor. Oh, they might need more drug. But it doesn't work that way with the endocannabinoid system. And to take an example is if we were to take the synovial fluid, like say in the joint, which is the fluid, like say in the knee, for example. And if we stick a needle in, we draw it out, we send it to the lab, and we're actually measuring your own endocannabinoids, okay? Like anandamide, which is one of your main, or 2-AG. These are the two main, your own endocannabinoids that your body's producing naturally. Is that if someone has a healthy knee, those levels are pretty much non-existent. Why? Because those cells are in a resting state. So the body's like, you know what? I'm perfect. I don't have any damage. I don't have any trauma. I don't have to send my troops. I don't have to send the repairmen to fight or fix, or I don't have to have the army out. Everything is fine. But what we find is that in someone who has osteoarthritis, those receptors start to turn on. And the body's saying, you know what? I'm having some inflammation. I'm having some creaking and achiness and pain in my joints. And say someone has rheumatoid arthritis, it's really on. It's really active. And when we draw that and we measure the amount of anandamide and 2-AG in the synovial fluid, it's off the chart. Why? Because the body's like, I need to fight, I need to fix, I need to repair. I'm damaged, I'm degenerative, I'm having inflammation, I'm swelling, I'm having pain. And so what this means, in short, that many people don't understand is that the worse the condition, actually, the less the amount of cannabinoids, CBD, is needed. And unfortunately, the whole system and the whole marketing right now, a lot of people don't like when I speak about this because companies want to sell more. but at the end of the day, as a physician, it is my responsibility to get the patient better. I have to see the patient before, I have to see them afterwards, and I have to see an improved outcome. A lot of people just market, and whether you get better or not, that's your issue. But they have to understand that when someone has a bigger tumor, when someone has a worse seizure, it's not giving them more. A lot of times it's actually giving them more smaller frequent doses because those receptors are very, very active. And so with the active state, little amount of those cannabinoids and terpenes need to be signaled to stimulate the benefits. And, that's why a lot of people who are super healthy, they take it again and they go, I didn't know it's anything. And I always tell people, well, if you have a good product, by the way, that actually has cannabinoids in there and terpenes in there. But if they were to take it and they're like, gosh, I don't really notice anything. Say if they took it for pain or taking it for sleep or maybe a little bit of anxiety, if they don't notice any benefits, first check the product. But number two, it might be a good sign because that means their body's not having some kind of imbalance in one of these areas. However, most people, since they have something going on in their body, inflammatory, anxiety, insomnia, some kind of pain or inflammation in their joints or muscles or back, for example, that when they take it, sometimes they take it for sleep and they'll say, gosh, it kind of helped my sleep, but my back feels better. So that also tells us that there's actually more inflammation in their body than they actually are aware of, because a lot of times we just become accustomed to that. So again, understanding this endocannabinoid system is key because it's about how the body is self-regulating, and we're trying to again bring the body back to homeostasis. So it's not like more is better. Sometimes in most cases we're looking at less is best. Now, other conditions like atherosclerosis. So again, it's not going to lower your cholesterol. So if you're eating that steak that they're making out there right now, it's not going to lower the cholesterol from that, right? But it lowers some of what they call the oxidative stress that's happening. We talked about colitis. We see it in diabetes. It helps lower, again, indirectly inflammatory responses that are affecting how glycemia is working. So it's not a diabetic medication. If you're diabetic and you're eating, standard American diet or eating, cookies right now, you take all the CBD you want, it's not going to lower your blood sugar. But we know that the regulation of those molecules in the syndromes, even how diabetics get cardiomyopathy and retinopathy, it can actually help prevent that, especially in type 1 diabetics. And then when we see like Parkinson's disease and we look at like MS, it actually helps with the regeneration of neurons. And so not only can we see that in the culture, they can actually add like viruses and toxins to actually induce, like when we do modeling of Parkinson's and MS. And we actually, when they add the CBD from hemp, it actually lowers the inflammation, but actually regenerates those neurons. So it's pretty cool. Maybe next time I'll do a lecture, I'll show you some photos, because when people actually see like these little things growing, it's quite impressive, because a lot of people think, okay, it's helpful, but how helpful is it? With the previous lecture, he was talking about PTSD. And the interesting thing is in the human study so far is that it does reduce the PTSD. Anandamide, which is produced in your body, your own endocannabinoid system, it is increased in the acute stage of trauma as a protective mechanism. But in a PTSD patient, those levels are actually reduced. So it's interesting. The body, you do want to forget things. You can't remember everything, and you don't want to remember everything. Otherwise, we'd be sad for everything that happened to us as in childhood, for example, or just at the store, something happened. So you want to forget certain things, and you want to remember certain things. And so it's the body's ability to actually protect itself so it won't have these kind of traumatic remembrances. The interesting thing is that when CBD is given to these patients, it can help them not only in the acute PTSD stage, which they've done in the studies, but also with the chronic emotional reminders of the stressor. So that's why it's part of this therapy when people going forward. It's not about, an antidepressant or an anti-anxiety drug that's kind of like taking your mind out of your body or just kind of suppressing a receptor or exciting a receptor. Is what we're trying to do is like, can we actually bring that body back into homeostasis? So I really enjoy using these kind of things because, again, for these 100,000 vets that are homeless, a lot of people have PTSD. Even everybody, I think, from 2020 has a little bit of, and even from this last week, have a lot of PTSD reliving this issue. And so this is something that can actually be helpful, because it's not being like forgetful or just like put your head in the sand, but it's like, we don't want people to have, traumatic memories that are constantly being reminded, and it's inhibiting them having a good function or quality of life. Traumatic brain injury, we see a lot of research, and now you'll start seeing pretty soon in some of the professional leagues, you'll start seeing in the next year or two actually sponsorship on television with cannabinoids companies and all, because we're looking at, how do we prevent when people are hitting themselves, say in football, even at a young age in high school, is that, now we're looking at that's causing this traumatic brain injury, and then they have more susceptibility to have depression, aggression, and even suicide and stuff like that. So partly is like if we can start using these things to help balance or even kind of lower their chronicity of inflammation and damage, that could be life-saving. Questions so far?
Tasha, you want to go first, or you want me to jump in?
Yeah, I have a really quick question. So,
sure.
Thank you, Dr. Pai, so much for being here and sharing all of this fantastic education with us. And you had already answered my question, but I just kind of wanted to reiterate for the viewers.
Sure.
You spoke specifically about where you can go to get more education on this, because especially as people begin their journey as I have, and I am an educator. So
right.
For me, especially, I'm very self-motivated. I want to go out, I want to get the information.
Sure.
I want to know as much about, these things as I can. All of this research is, somewhat relatively new, like you said, since 2016 for the most part. Where can people go whenever they would like to do self-study? I mean, your book is there in the background, but do you have a podcast? Do you have?
Yeah, I mean, we do have some old. We have a podcast on our website. If you go to sanjevani.net, sanjevani.net, you can look at all of them. And we're going to restart it this year. We had it a year ago. 28 episodes. Also on bloomhemp.com, we're going to be adding a educational section, so that, everything that we publish, a lot of times, I do interviews that are, more scientific or scientific journalists, like how do we explain this to the public kind of thing. And so we're going to be comprising all of those. We'll also be doing some podcasts and also some video webinar presentations, because I think, unless you've gone to medical school, even if you went to medical school, this is all sometimes just, this is chemistry and numbers, right? Like, so the average person, like, it's just kind of like if you're talking to the chef, and the chef's like, he's talking about something in the kitchen, like the average person may not even know what he's talking about, like, because a special tool or a special herb is like, if it's not in their grocery sack, they may not understand it. So what we're trying to do is kind of distill it down. And it's one of the things that on our website on bloomhemp.com is that we actually have a lot of infographics, and I find that using infographics is simple, because the idea is, how do we take this complex information and kind of distill it down, just so that someone like you or anybody else, like, oh, I don't have to sit there and study, go to school and learn about this, but I need to get a basic understanding of what it is doing and what it is not doing, and how I can kind of explain it to my friends or my family, or because I know everybody a lot of people, especially in the space, who are educators, they're so excited in one way because they've had some kind of experience with it, right? Like they've taken it and something's happened. So they're like, oh, but then sometimes like their friend who they recommended to, like, nothing happens. And they're like, well, what are you doing? Or why is that? And so, I think our goal is to provide that kind of education, not only to the healthcare providers, but also to that. Now, for those people who want to just deep dive, like, I just want to know everything, then, just go to PubMed. If you go to PubMed, that's the governmental website that you can look up all the research that's, published in any journal in any kind of language. And then you can just look up endocannabinoid system and type in different things, and just, it comes up every day. Every day I do about an hour, 2 hours of research, because that's my patients come in with cancer. They come in with different things. There's studies coming out every day on everything. And so, even if you're looking at something from COVID to just heart disease, every day there's 100 new articles on these things. And so we always want to take, how to distill that. Sometimes PubMed might be a little bit too scientific, but at least it gives people an idea of, like, okay, is it good or is it not? Sometimes they can just glean the abstracts. They don't have to read the full journal article. They can just say, does that have some kind of positive benefit? And if it does, then at least there's a little bit more evidence for them and confidence to say, I should be using this or recommending this. But if it says, oh, it doesn't do that, then if they're saying it does, probably they're not speaking correctly.
Yeah, and the reason why I was asking that is because, again, our topic is empowerment for today. Yeah. And for me as an educator, decades-long educator, for me, the greatest empowerment is knowledge and education.
Sure, 100%.
And, there are very reputable places that you can go out, including the government, where you can go get these research articles and websites like yours and books like yours, written by professional people that have a vested interest in educating the public in their path to wellness and in empowering them on their path to wellness. So
right. And one of the things that we're going to be moving forward, and we can always do another interview, is understanding. So like, because, you know, a lot of people will get a basic understanding of the science. So, okay, it can work for this, it doesn't work for this, or this is how we may be able to deliver it. Then where the biggest failure that I see clinically is, now that people are interested or are actively participating in this field or arena of health, is, you know, how do we look at a product now, and then how do we know, you know, potency, purity, safety, and efficacy? That's kind of the mantra. You know, when I bring my expertise, you know, as a chief medical officer to Bloom, it's like, how do we look at potency, purity, safety, efficacy? How do we develop a certificate of analysis that, you know, can show, here's your cannabidiol profile, here's your terpene profile, here's no pesticides, herbicides, solvents, mycotoxins. And if people don't understand anything that I'm saying in that thing, then that means it's very scary place to be in the space, because right now, most companies, most products, if I go to the grocery store, health food store, they will fail the test. Or companies that say, oh, we have all this, we run an independent analysis of that through a lab, and it doesn't even have the terpenes or the cannabinoids that they proclaim. So we really want to get to, because at the end of the day, we want this space to grow. And over time, as you know, as I know, it's going to be more regulated. And the only way that we can make it still kind of, you know, a people's thing or something that's in the natural world is always using it safely and effectively and appropriately, because there's always going to be one bad apple, he's going to say, in the bunch that kind of makes it like, oh, and then, you know, the government or the Congress or someone is going to say, that's really bad, let's only make it a drug. And that's not the goal, but the goal is that we want to prevent it so that we don't get bad press. We only want good press. So eventually, you know, we can use, you know, one of the focuses for 2021 with Bloom, and what we're looking at even in my practice and all stuff is like, you know, all things hemp. So we're looking at even like the food aspects. You know, they've developed a food line of looking at, you know, the hemp seed butter. You know, like, how do we take this whole plant and make, you know, clothing or food in, you know, nutrition? So it's not just, you know, CBD. It's kind of, it's good, and it's kind of like overdone on some levels. And so the idea is like, how do we understand plant medicines and just the plant itself, and understanding all those aspects, everything about it, is making it into a lifestyle. So then this will go into like, well, gosh, if I'm kind of in this world, then maybe I should be looking at my diet and lifestyle as well. Like if I understand plant medicine is so important, then why aren't I eating more plants? Right. So like, so if someone's eating a standard American diet, they're like all about CBD and hemp or cannabis, then it's like they're missing the understanding of how plant medicines work and how the physiological body works. So hopefully that will shift people like, wow, if this does so well, maybe I'll eat more fruits and vegetables, legumes, and, you know, grains and things like that, and meat or organically. Hopefully it leads them to understand that food is medicine. And this is just one of the avenues and aspects of that journey.
Yes. And I think Charles has a question.
So you mentioned there that CBD may be a little bit overdone, and one of my biggest passions is the other cannabinoids. What other cannabinoids are you excited about? Do you see big potential in?
I mean, you know, when we look at like CBC, CBN, CBV, CBG, you know, and then now we're looking at all the different type of major terpenes and looking at, you know, because what we're trying to do is follow in the literature, they'll always look at, you know, different strains of cannabis, right? And they'll say like, this is a strain that has been shown for this, or even the patients or clinically, people would say. But what we're now finding out that when they actually comprise, you know, there used to be this idea that, you know, all these strains produce different chemical profiles. And then in the last 2 years, when they actually, I was at a conference, a CBD cannabis conference, researching conference, and when they looked at the top 40 strains that are given into dispensaries, which, you know, everybody will know these names, these are the popular names. You know, out of 40 strains, all of them, they all kind of had this aggregate in the middle. Because what happens is there have been over, what do you call it? It's too much breeding of the plant. So like if you had a strain that was from the 60s, for example, like in your backyard or you know, some mountains or something, actually you'd have a full profile, because as people were, especially were increasing the THC in a lot of these products, right? For other reasons, whatever reason they wanted to do. But as they do that, it was actually lowering all the other cannabinoid profiles and terpene profiles. And so even though it might be like super, super high THC, for example, like in a dispensary, is that all these other wonderful compounds that you'd be looking at, and even there's going to be probably dozens and dozens and dozens of more compounds aside of even the terpenes and aside of the ones I just mentioned that we'll kind of discover. But that's all being lowered because the plants are being pushed, that, you know, we want to put, especially in the cannabis world, they want to keep pushing this THC up. There was only 3 strains, I don't remember their names, but there was 3 strains in the study that were actually outside that aggregate, meaning they actually were phytochemically different, so a lot of it that comes to us then when we see the people going to dispensary, a lot of times it's just how it's sold, the name and who sold it to them, and the environment and the feeling that they feel comfortable, and that's okay, because placebo is great. I mean, anything to make people feel better, I'm all for. It's not, as long as it's clean, it's not, it's pure, it doesn't have chemicals and pesticides, herbicides, and blah blah blah, fine. But there's a little bit of aspect of like, you'll see people like, it's got to be this, it's got to be that, and at the end of the day, it's like we're kind of missing the point. It's like if we can go back to understanding, I'll give you an example. When we look at cannabis now, even when we look at hemp, there's difference in the phytochemical profile, whether it's grown outside or grown inside, whether it's grown hydroponic. So even though we can improve yield, right, in a hothouse, for example, is that because I study herbal medicine, and so when we formulate and we look at, we have patents and we have companies that do clinical trials, is that say if we were to take a plant from India or Tibet or South America or Russia, it's growing in a certain environment, and based on that environment, it stresses that plant to create its own phytochemistry, right? So that's why like an adaptogen, for example, growing on the top of the mountain or growing in the hot of the desert, why is it surviving? Because it's producing something. Now, if I take that and I put it in a hothouse and I can make it grow 10 times faster, 10 times bigger, although our production yield in terms of a manufacturer facility is like, oh, I can have this 24 times, I can make this all the time and all. The healing properties of all those phytonutrients and all the entourages, you would call it, all these other chemicals are different. And so that's where like we're kind of, because as this becomes a production now, right? Like, because everybody's like production and there's dispensaries and demand and this and that, and it's automation in a way. We're losing that kind of like the true, like farm to table. There's a difference between someone organically growing something from a soil, having heirloom tomato, or then getting a hothouse tomato. Even though it still might be organic, it's still on the vine, it still looks good and all, is actually we look at the nutrient levels are different. So I think over time, we're going to see in the industry that those who will survive, because this will be an oversaturated industry, in my opinion, in the next 5 years. Because remember, we're having big, large conglomerates come in. We're having, multinational corporations, even senators and congressmen who are so against all this stuff now we're on the head of boards of these companies, ironically, that, it's going to change because it's going to be, and unfortunately, I still want the local farmers. I still want people to have the ability to find, this is something maybe in Oregon, this is something maybe in Texas, this is something somewhere in Kansas, to have a uniqueness rather than, okay, here's the Coca-Cola and Pepsis of the cannabis industry coming in and kind of taking over. So once they do that, then the efficacy in terms of, that specific potency, even when we see with the drug companies, I'll give you an example right now, when we get the prescription drugs, right? Some of the prescription drugs were very helpful, so, on the CBD studies, and then some of the studies they failed. And why they failed, especially with some of the things with PTSD and some of these other things, because we're missing all these other compounds, right? So we're trying to pull out one thing and say this is a patent from a pharmaceutical company in England, and they want to be like, okay, we want to control this market, but the plant, like you don't just pull out one part of the plant. You have to have, there is some, we call the Superman or Wonder Woman of the plant, the Black Panther of the plant of the plant, but you still need to have the rest of your team. You still have to have all the other Avengers to actually have it work better. And so this is where I think in the future we have to go back and so when we are looking at, for example, with Bloom, and we're looking at profiles, we're trying to match when they have that aspect in the literature. And this is, here's the profile. We're trying to reproduce it. So just as a chef would be cultivating, he's saying, this is the best food, and this is how I get it, and it's going to be this point score, to make it the best flavor, the best taste, even the coffee, right? We want to be doing that with the plant. Because you just can't treat every hemp plant or every cannabis plant the same. Right now, everybody thinks it's the same, but just as this guy at coffee he was talking about, well, I'm sure his coffee tastes really good, and there's a reason, right? Because how they grow, where they grow, the temperature, the season, the sun, the soil, that all makes a difference. So I think when it comes to the plant medicine, we have to understand it the same way.
Thank you, Dr. Pai. This has been a very educational session.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions?
Yes, we have one more question from Dr. Golda in Panama.
Okay.
Hi, Dr. Pai.
Hi.
Nice to meet you.
Nice meeting you.
Yeah. I basically don't have a question. I have a deep affinity with what you've spoken, and I wanted to introduce you to the Jade Health platform that last year we were featuring on the Canna World Expo, and I think there'd be a very interesting collaboration.
Okay. Well, thank you. Nice meeting you. Yeah,
Yeah.
you know, I mean, from my perspective, what I want, you know, a lot of people sometimes think I come a little bit harsher, a little bit, but at the end of the day, you know, I'm responsible for people. You know, I'm saying I'm responsible to see someone get through cancer or get over a condition, where everybody else can talk about it. You know, the burden falls on us, and so, but at the end of the day, we don't want to also be the only person who's helping people. We want people. But my job is if I prevent people from getting disease or lower it, my job's easier. Everybody's job is easier. So for me, it's sharing that information, but it's also providing that expert guidance, because if we do it correctly, I think this movement will pervade and actually be seen in a better light. Right now, it's kind of, there's pro cannabis people, and there's right now there's still 50% of the country is like, they're not sure what it is because of bad publicity in the news, the media. So I think if we can change that, the only way we can change that is by everybody kind of raising the bar of potency, purity, safety, efficacy. How do we promote it? How do we talk about it on social media? Or how does the news even get it right in the headlines? If we do that correctly, then I think this whole movement will have a profound impact on people's health. And I would definitely would like to talk to you later on this. Yeah,
I agree, because Jade Health's platform is one that's able to take the research data input from the consumer side. So we're not creating a drug. And therefore, if you're not creating a drug and you're just aggregating the data through software that's available in the cloud, it makes it a lot easier to get to the facts on how the phytocannabinoids really do have an impact on the endocannabinoid system with individuals with specific conditions. So I'm eternally appreciative to
and I think the more data driven that we do have this, then then everybody else can market how they want to and take parts of it, do whatever. But at the end of the day, it does, I think just with anything like a car or anything, everybody had to figure out all the parts, and now you can have an electric car, you can have a truck, you can have a this. Yeah, but we start to understand like what an engine was and what were four tires, and until we get to that point where we feel completely we understand the structure, then how people want to build it and reconstruct it is fine with me.
Right. And as we know in medicine, one size does not fit all.
One size does not fit all.
Platform where we can move from substrate and seed and through the track and trace system,
absolutely,
regulations into the clinic to really support the end user. To personalize it along with all the other integrative medicine pieces.
Absolutely. Because, when it comes
and that's what I felt was missing. So that's what I've created. So
wonderful. Because, just like the supplement industry in the beginning, there was a lot of problems, and now it's kind of getting better. It still needs a lot more improvement, but the cannabis and the hemp world, there is really no regulation. There's no, states are just collecting taxes, right? But there's not even a document like maybe you should wash your hands after you use the restroom to touch these products in a dispensary. So we still have a lot place to go because we're so behind. And just a salon will have more regulation than a dispensary, really, in a way. I mean, although they still have to pay taxes and regulate in terms of safety and money and whatnot and keeping and storage, but in terms of just handling products, like should they use pesticides, herbicides, or what? That's not really even there. I know there's a lot of self-regulation. So there's a lot of companies that do it their own way because they want to do it right. But there's also a lot of people that we see that haven't done it the right way. And this is where, again, we're just trying to take away the negative headlines that might be coming in the future. So I appreciate what you're doing. Aggregating data is always good for everybody.
And one more thing, Dr. Pai.
Sure.
We do have a question from the audience, and thank you, audience, for pre-registering and for submitting your questions. I do notice behind you your book, The Inflammation Nation. Thank you for putting that up.
My shameless plug, as I call it. It's available. It's available on iTunes and Audible if you like to listen to it. It's professionally read. It's about 16 hours.
Great. This question has to do with arthritic pain. So obviously it has to do with inflammation.
Yes.
The question is, what's the difference between CBD, CBN, CBDA, and other non-psychoactive, non-psychotropic cannabis forms? Which is a better way to get the best result for arthritic pain? Is that question answered in your book?
Not that. That's not. Well, my book's going to cover like all the different things that trigger inflammatory responses, and the use of CBD can be one of the options that people can use to lower inflammation. But the goals, the key is understanding is like why we like the cannabinoids, all of them, by the way, because they all have some kind of anti-inflammatory aspect. Some of them have a little bit more. Okay, helps with nausea, GI, stomach, different parts, and then that's that's even changing as the days go on, right? But what we understand is that why we like those things over long periods of time is because there's a repairing and healing mechanism to that, versus just like when people just take, say, THC from cannabis, it may help the pain, but it's not an anti-inflammatory directly. It's not helping the repair. So it's a little bit more like taking their body out of mind. And sometimes when people have chronic pain, absolutely indicated, right? But from our perspective, we will, in my book, what I cover is not only just lowering the inflammatory responses by using these things, what are the other things that you can use that was actually will be more synergistic or actually more direct to the joints? And then more importantly, what are the things that the patient or the person is doing that's contributing to causing their inflammation? Because arthritis is inflammation of the joint, but we have to say is what is coming in their environment, their diet, lifestyle, environment that's coming in. So if they're eating any kind of pro-inflammatory food, or they have a food sensitivity, or they have any kind of microbiome dysfunction, this is things that are triggering inflammation, because they shouldn't be having people shouldn't have arthritis right now. Like these are, and people think, oh, this is a disease of aging. It's not a disease of aging. It's a disease of chronic inflammation over time. And so you have to look at, all the, and my book will cover all the detail with all the kind of conditions and diseases, because it's going to reframe. We think that as we get older, we're supposed to have these things, and, or maybe I got an injury 20 years ago, maybe I served in the military, maybe I got in a car accident, my back hurts. Why is it still hurting now? You're still not in the back. You're not playing football. You're not in a war. You're not in a car accident. Why is it still hurting? Because there's something still in the diet and the lifestyle environment. My book will cover that, and also provide how we evaluate that, and then also what are the solutions for that. And then we also do consultations. We do Zoom consultations all around the world so I have clients from everywhere. So it's nice that, they don't have to be here in Albuquerque. We can help them with all these things.
Okay, fantastic. And one last question: How do people get a hold of you after this presentation?
So they can go to Sanjevani.net is our main website, SANJEVANI.net. If they want to read more, they can go to on the book. They can go to inflammationnation.com. And then on our website, we have we have all our different podcasts with interviews with different doctors and researchers on a variety of inflammatory topics and in diet and lifestyle. And we have some educational. We have and also on our store, Sanjevani, SANJEVANI store, STOR.com. We also have, like, anytime we have a product and we have data, then we'll have the data links in the product pages. So we're trying to bring everything to as much evidence base. So if there's an article like, hey, this might be something to help prevent this or reduce this or lower it, we have to back that up, because we want people to understand that there is science behind natural medicines, but we also have to give that guidance correctly and find the right appropriate product.
Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Pai. You are a walking encyclopedia. We so appreciate you.
Well, thank you. Thanks to your audience for taking the time to listen today. I appreciate that.